If you have your Bibles with you, I'd like you to open to Romans chapter 15. Romans chapter 15. Got a lot of things I want to touch on today, but just one passage. We're not going to be hopping around like I do sometimes. Romans chapter 15, verse 1. And this is the Holman version. Now we who are strong have an obligation to bear the weaknesses of those without strength and not to please ourselves. Today's Sunday, January 16th, and today is Sanctity of Life Sunday. Sanctity means something sacred. It means that it's valuable. It's holy. And our lives are valuable to God. Like we talked about in Sunday school, we know that He cares for us individually. We know that He formed us in the womb. We know that He knows everything about us and loves us and cares for us intimately. We're not just a blip on the radar to Him. Our lives are valuable. Everyone's life is valuable as an image bearer of God. Every life is sacred as an image bearer of God. And our go-to, oftentimes, is abortion on this topic. It's one of the biggest, most relevant topics to it. But I've got a handful of topics I'm going to touch on with this today. I've got a handful of topics where human lives aren't being valued by mankind the way they're valued by God. And we need to take verses like this seriously. We who are strong have an obligation to bear the weaknesses of those without strength, rather than pleasing ourselves. What's pleasing ourselves? Well, it's easy to just turn a blind eye to different things and say, that's not my problem. You know, if something bad's happening on the other side of the world, it doesn't affect me. There's nothing I can do about it. That's pleasing ourselves. That's giving up. We who are strong have an obligation. Obligation. We have to do it. You know, as far as abortion goes, God created us with value, and He says we're not supposed to kill people. If that part of the message needs any further explanation, then we ought to lock these doors and walk out, because we've failed God if we try to justify. But organizations like Planned Parenthood, we often talk about the origins of it. We talk about people like Margaret Sanger and how she spoke about wanting to depopulate, black communities and poor communities. And I want to touch on some of the things that she said. We usually we speak a little bit on that, but have we ever really looked into a lot of what she said? 1922, she said, "We are paying for and even submitting to the dictates of an ever-increasing, unceasingly spawning class of human beings who never should have been born at all." She said that in 1922. And in her writings, we know that she wanted to decimate the black communities and the poor communities. And she was into things like eugenics. You know, if they're gonna have health problems, maybe they shouldn't be born at all. Those kind of mindsets. 1924, she said, "If plants and livestock as well require space and air, sunlight and love, children need them even more. The only real wealth of our country lies in the men and women of the next generation. A farmer would rather produce 1,000 thoroughbreds than 1,000,000 runts. How are we to breed a race of human thoroughbreds unless we follow the same plan. We must make this country into a garden of children instead of a disorderly backlot overrun with human weeds. Does that sound like someone who values human life? Does that sound like someone who looks at people and think, that's a valuable image bearer of God, their life matters? In a letter she wrote, now there was a project that she had worked on. It was called the Negro Project of the South. And this was a side project that was put on by the original company that is now known as Planned Parenthood. And even though, if we look it up, it says that this, what is called the Negro Project of the South, said it was ended after about 3 years. I can't help but wonder if the same policies and practices were integrated into the main of the company, the whole of the company with Planned Parenthood. But she says there is only one thing, and this is a letter she wrote to Dr. C.J. Gamble in December of 1939. There's only one thing that I would like to be in touch with, and that is the Negro Project of the South, which, if the execution of the details remain in Miss Rose's hands, my suggestions will not be confusing because she knows how my mind works. She knows the way my mind works. Miss Rose sent me a copy of your letter, December 5th, and I note that you doubt it worthwhile to employ a full-time Negro physician. It seems to me from my experience where I've been in North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, and Texas, that while the colored Negroes have great respect for white doctors, they can get closer to their own members and more or less lay their cards on the table, which means their ignorance, superstitions, and doubts. They do not do this with the white people, and if we can train the Negro doctor at the clinic, he can go among them with enthusiasm and with knowledge, which I believe will have far-reaching results among the colored people. His work, in my opinion, should be entirely with the Negro profession and the nurses, hospitals, social workers, as well as the county's white doctors. His success will depend on his personality and his training by us. The minister's work is also important and also should be trained, perhaps by the Federation, as to our ideals and the goals that we hope to reach. We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population, and the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members. Does that sound like someone who values human lives? I wasn't even comfortable reading that. I can't imagine being the one who said it. But they're going to hire and train doctors to convince them of this. They're going to hire and train ministers to convince them of this. And I guarantee they found both. They found, sadly enough, doctors, but they, I'm sure, also found ministers who were willing enough to forsake the value of human life that they participated in this. She said, birth control propaganda is thus the entering wedge for the eugenic educator. Basically, if eugenics, they want to weed out people with mental or physical defects, as she ends up putting it. She's basically saying that birth control propaganda is the way to get our foot in the door for convincing people of that. And that's how a lot of times, that's how Satan works. Don't let him get his foot in the door, because he'll keep inching his way forward. And something as simple and innocent sounding as they would say, well, let's put out pamphlets on birth control. It's health. It's a health issue. But it was to get their foot in the door to start spreading the notion of eugenics. So she says, birth control propaganda is thus the entering wedge for the eugenic educator. And she goes on to say, the most urgent problem today is how to limit and discourage the over-fertility of the mentally and physically defective. It's something she said in 1921. This is an organization that was started that was conceived by this woman who had no value for people with health problems, for people with mental problems, for the black community, for the poor communities. Where was the sanctity of their life? Why aren't their lives sacred to her? Why aren't their lives sacred to places like Planned Parenthood? It seems like it was a big project that was intentionally done. It was intentionally pushed. We see from these things that we got Sanger, plus doctors, plus ministers, plus propaganda. That sounds like a conspiracy to me. People flippantly use the word conspiracy and automatically think it means something that's not true. It means when a bunch of people, or any group of people, collaborates together to plan and do bad things. That's what this sounds like to me. But when people want to shut up notions like that, they'll flash out that word. You know, I believe that in my lifetime I will see Roe versus Wade get overturned. I believe in my lifetime that we will see an end to Planned Parenthood. I really do. There's a lot happening that isn't in the limelight that a lot of people don't see. Certain things get maybe reported on and then just shuffled to the bottom of the deck while meaningless things are elevated on the news. But there's a lot of things that are happening. There's a lot of places other than that news channel you can learn things. You can get online and look up things that are on congressional record. You can look up things that are announced by the Department of Justice. You can see things that are posted or leaked online personally by and about the people involved in these things. There's a lot of stuff that most people don't see. And there's a lot of things happening right now. And I've spent a lot of time looking into things like that. And let me tell you, this world is going to be changing in big ways, in great ways. And right now, there's a lot happening. There were some videos that came out, and it seems like nothing's coming of it, but I believe that wheels of justice are just moving kind of slowly. There were a lot of undercover videos made of people who went out to lunch with higher-ups from Planned Parenthood, and they caught them on video talking about and making deals about a lot of very immoral and very illegal things. You know, it's illegal to sell body parts. It's illegal to, you can, donate them for scientific purposes, but we're talking organ harvesting, we're talking about selling limbs, we're talking about cases where these fetuses are kept alive, these babies are kept alive long enough to have fresh organs harvested later. I'm going to talk about some rough things today, and there's a lot of things that I could talk about that I won't. Because if I talked about everything I'd like to, none of us would be sleeping tonight. Our own FDA has purchased body parts from them through brokers. This is a federal crime. It's a federal felony. Like I've talked about before, we got evil forces in this world. There's a lot of evil influence, a lot of satanic, demonic influence in this world. We read through our Bibles and we see all these cases of people influenced or possessed. Do we really think that once the authors of the Bible put down their pens, that all these evil forces said, well, let's call it a day since we're not getting any publicity? A lot of evil is in this world. There is an Aztec temple And without having it written down in front of me, I won't even try to pronounce it. But there was an Aztec temple that was known for a lot of child sacrifices. And if you look at a side-by-side view, or a split-screen view, the Planned Parenthood headquarters is identical. It's stair steps down like this temple. That's not an accident. I could show you other corporations and businesses that have done similar things. One headquarters is modeled after, obviously we don't know exactly what the Tower of Babel looked like, but there's historical artwork that was supposed to depict it, and it was modeled after that. Ungodly things that are being emulated and pushed. Aside from the lives of infants, there are a lot of other people groups. But we who are strong have an obligation to bear the weaknesses of those without strength and not to please ourselves. Pleasing ourselves means saying big deal and moving on. There's a lot we can do. We can be speaking up more. People can protest. People can write politicians. Make their voices heard. Because it does. It makes a difference. If there's one thing that I've learned over the past couple years, is that the more something is pushed into the spotlight, the more they have no choice but to address it. We need to stick up for those without strength to do it for themselves. And beyond infants, there's children. Children whose lives aren't held as sacred. The sanctity of their life is thrown to the garbage. There's so much human trafficking, child trafficking in this world. It's enormous. You know, we see these things about Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, and praise God she was recently convicted. And if you just watch what is put in front of us in the news, you'll see stories about wealthy people or famous people or things like that who were with underage girls. And the only girls that they have talked about are, let's say, 17 years old. That in itself is wrong, but it doesn't even scratch the surface of what's really happening with all that. What's going on in that world is the stuff of nightmares. Their lives are not held as sacred. You know, every year there's 840,000 kids that go missing. Every 37 seconds, a child goes missing. So that means about 35 kids have been kidnapped since the sermon started. Every 37 seconds. And that sounds insane. That sounds impossible. How can there be that many people just randomly abducting kids? And it's not because it's all just randomly people. This is a business. This isn't just random fluke people who are doing bad things. Yes, there's a lot of individual kids that get kidnapped. We've heard about some recently, not far away. Praise God, the one was just recovered recently. It's a business. It's a business of people who think they're above the law. And I've seen enough to know that the law's catching up with them. We who are strong have an obligation to bear the weaknesses of those without strength. We who are strong have an obligation to bear the weaknesses of those children without strength. Not to please ourselves. And pleasing ourselves looks like saying, well, that's awful, but there's nothing I can do. It means walking past the wall at Walmart that's got all the missing children on it and saying, wow, that's terrible, and not giving it a second thought. I hate to say at the minimum we could be praying for them, but that's not a minimum act. There's a lot we can do. It's things like that can seem scary and overwhelming, and we want to just keep it out of our minds because it's an awful thing. We need to learn about it. We need to learn what's happening. We need to expose it. We need to demand something's done about it. We need to get our heads out of the sand. Don't allow things like that to be swept under the rug. You know, they had Epstein in 2009. They had him, they had evidence, the FBI investigated him, and they did nothing. They did nothing. And reporters who even tried to talk about it were cut off and silenced. They've even spoken on that since then. There's reporters that have said, we knew what was going on with Epstein. We all knew. All of us knew. They wouldn't let us talk about it. Because when you're rich enough to have private islands and rich enough to have the wealthiest people in the world be involved in horrible things like this, you're wealthy enough to shut up the right people. Exposure works. Most people before 2 years ago had never heard that name before. They had no idea who he was. And people started talking about it. And what did everyone call it? They called it a conspiracy theory. Stuff like this isn't going on. And now it's blatantly obvious. It's gone through court. He's died, but his girlfriend, who the more I look into it, I'm wondering if she wasn't behind most of this stuff, was recently convicted on 5 or 6 counts of this. And they're trying to keep her little black book secret, but that's not working very well either. 2 years ago, when all this stuff started happening, it was implicated that Prince Andrew was involved. With Virginia Giuffre was the girl, or at least one of them. And that was blown off as ridiculous. We don't want to think the worst in people. So when we hear something big and somebody who we don't see as a villain, it sounds ridiculous and absurd. Let me tell you something. In looking into this, I've seen so many things that were directly said or posted or tweeted or said in interviews openly by people you would never expect it from. I'm not even going to list names right now because I could and you wouldn't believe me. Because they seem so friendly and happy-go-lucky whenever you see them. If I showed you some of the things that they've said, even on video, on this TV, you'd probably be throwing up. But exposure works. 2 years ago, it was ridiculous that this was even a notion that Prince Andrew was involved. And now that Maxwell's been convicted, judges are turning their way towards him. The monarchy just basically disavowed him, stripped him of his royal titles. They don't want any part of him. They know what's going on. This wasn't a surprise. They didn't just find out about things like this. They just have no choice but to act on it because the public knows so much about it. That's why God tells us to shine light on darkness in this world. Don't let them hide in the corners, in the dark corners. You think that family didn't know? Prince Charles's good buddy, British celebrity Jimmy Savile, was found out that he had abused at least 500 boys. Don't quote me on that. It was children. I don't know that it was all boys. So his little brother and his close friend are into things like this, and it's just a coincidence, and nobody really knows about it. We're just finding out. We have an obligation, we who are strong have an obligation to bear the weaknesses of those without strength against people like this. Their lives are valuable. Their lives are sacred. You know who else's lives are sacred and valuable? People who are broken. People who are suicidal. People who are suffering. People who are in places where they are having a hard time seeing the value of their own life. Be there for people. God calls us to be there for each other. We don't know who's like that. We don't know who needs us. Maybe somebody says, I need to talk to you, and we think, well, I'm busy with such and such, and we blow them off. What if they were wanting to talk to you because they don't feel like anybody cares about them? And that was the last straw. You know, the world's been through a lot in the last couple years. Kids have been feeling isolated, being stuck at home, not around friends. They need those interactions. People who have been stuck in, especially the more extreme lockdowns, long-term ones, some countries are worse than others. They get isolated. What happens when grandma and grandpa are at the nursing home and no one's allowed to come visit them? You can't have any contact with your loved ones. That weighs on people. It drags on them. Suicides have gone up since this started. And in other areas with soldiers, those have increased. Just last year, just this past year, the Pentagon said, just from July to September, not even the full year, from July to September, 163 soldiers committed suicide. We need to be doing better as a society. We need to be reaching out to people. We need to have programs in place that will help these kind of people. I don't have current info, but in 2019 it says there was over 47,500 people who committed suicide in the U.S. Just in the U.S., 47,500. That's what, like 5 Upper Sandusky's? And 3.5 million people attempted to commit suicide. That means either somebody killed themselves or they tried to kill themselves every 9 seconds in 2019. We got to help those people. They have weaknesses that they need us to bear. They need someone to bear. We who are strong, God says, have an obligation. Got to be there for each other. Another case where life isn't valued, the sanctity of life is not upheld, it's not held as sacred, is in genocides. I mentioned a case that I did a report on in Sunday school and things like that. We know of things like the Holocaust that took place. Value of life wasn't taken seriously. It wasn't upheld. It wasn't valued, period. But this isn't just things from history. Things like this are going on right now. Right now, there's genocide being committed. Have you ever heard of the Uyghurs? It's spelled, it looks like Uyghur, U-Y-G-H-U-R. It's pronounced the Uyghurs. They live in China. They're from Turkey. They're mostly Muslim. And China, the government has been kidnapping them. They've been putting them in re-education camps, government indoctrination camps. They've been beaten, they've been sterilized, they've been tortured, they've been raped, they've been sexually abused. All these things en masse. They've been used for slave labor. Why do you think that stuff we buy from China is so much cheaper than the stuff we buy here? Because they can make it for nothing in a lot of cases. An article from the BBC talking about this. This isn't just a speculation kind of thing. It says several countries, including the U.S., Canada, and the Netherlands, have accused China of committing genocide, defined by international convention as the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And that's exactly what's happening here. They are an ethnic, religious group that is being destroyed. The declarations follow reports that, as well as interning the Uyghurs in camps, China has been forcibly mass sterilizing Uyghur women to suppress the population, separating children from their families and attempting to break the cultural traditions of the group. The U.S. Secretary of State has said that China is committing genocide and crimes against humanity. The UK Foreign Secretary said that the treatment of the Uyghurs amounts to, quote, appalling violations of the most basic human rights. And the UK Parliament declared in 2021 that China was committing genocide in Xinjiang. UN Human Rights Committee in 2018 said that it had credible reports that China was holding up to 1 million people in counter-extremism centers in Xinjiang. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute found evidence that in 2020, more than 380 of these re-education camps were in Xinjiang, and that was an increase of 40% on what they thought before. Leaked documents known as the China cables made clear that the camps were intended to be run as high-security prisons with strict discipline and punishments. People who have managed to escape the camps have reported physical, mental, and sexual torture. Women have spoken of mass rape and sexual abuse. We who are strong have an obligation to bear the weaknesses of those without strength and not to please ourselves by saying, that's not my problem. And you think, what can we do? I don't have a jet. I can't get to China to go try to help them. And even if I could, what good could I do there? There's a lot we can do. We can boycott things. We can write politicians. We can just expose. Because the more things are exposed, the more they have no choice but to do something about it. You know, most people don't know a lot about a lot of this stuff. If the whole world knew about this, don't you think there would be more push? And if the whole world cared about this and cared about the value and the sanctity of life, don't you think there would be a push to end this? We've got to make the world listen. What would have happened if the world just ignored Hitler and said, that's not my problem? I bet we wouldn't be speaking English right now. We have to value human life. We have to value it the way God values it, the way God values us. Another example of how we who are strong have an obligation to bear the weaknesses of those without strength and not to please ourselves. I want to talk about the elderly. And I'm not talking about things like euthanasia, which obviously is right in this camp. But their lives have been put at risk in ways that they shouldn't have been.